Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football with week one in the books, taking a look at where the Big Ten power rankings sit heading into week two. A couple significant changes, right? I think you got to look at this USC team as a legit contender in the Big Ten. I think our biggest question mark we had about USC was, hey, is this defense going to be turned around year one under Coach Lynn? I think we got that answer in a big way against LSU, holding an LSU offense that I think is going to be one of the better offenses that we see in the country. They held them 20 points. I don't think there's going to be too many other big changes that we have in the Big Ten. We're going to get a lot of answers to these Big Ten power rankings over the next couple of weeks. Want to get into where these teams sit after week one. Fired up to get into it now. Before we do, and as always, let it fly in the comment section. There are a lot of different ways you can stack these Big Ten teams. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section. All the support from the Big Ten fans. As a Michigan fan myself, I love talking this conference. So appreciate you guys rocking with it. Let it fly in the comments section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this one and let's start with the contenders, where there's not necessarily a significant shakeup in teams are dropping out of that contender category, but I did kind of play around with how I evaluate each of these teams in that contender spot, right? Moving Ohio State above Oregon. Now, maybe an overreaction, right? I was pretty vocal that I picked Oregon to win the Big Ten heading into the 2024 year. Look, Oregon on the scoreboard did not look great against Idaho, but I've dove into that game. I don't think it was nearly as bad as, a lot of national media members would like to say about that Oregon team. It was a 10-point game against the FCS. Dan Lanning made that very clear that that is not the standard for this Oregon program. But you look at how that game went, there were a couple of key plays that, Oregon just didn't execute on. But you kind of dive into the game. Oregon had 3 times as many first downs, well over double the amount of total yards Idaho had. It was a much more dominant performance for Oregon than what was reflected on the scoreboard. And at the end of the day, Oregon has 15 transfers coming into this football team, a lot of which are going to be significant contributors for the Oregon Ducks. I think it was fair to, give Oregon a little bit of leeway in terms of getting all these transfers settled on this roster heading into 2024. And I think, we're going to get a really big answer in terms of how good Oregon is against a very good Boise State team week two. Now, I bumped up Ohio State. You could go back and forth. I think Oregon and Ohio State, from a pure roster standpoint, look to me like the best 2 teams in the country. That being said, Penn State, Michigan, and USC are certainly teams that can win the Big Ten. And I want to start with Penn State. The biggest question, and one of the most underrated conversations really across college football, was Coach Koldnicki coming in and running this Penn State offense. We've known for years that Penn State can win the Big Ten, be one of the best teams in the country with how good their defense is. My opinion on that has not changed. Now, you look at this Penn State offense, yeah, the numbers were always okay when they played inferior opponents. But when they played Ohio State and played Michigan, the offense was not nearly good enough. And I think a large part of it was you kind of lacked that explosive offense that you wanted to see from Penn State. They go out and get an offensive coordinator who is, for lack of better terms, a genius at dialing it up and creating explosive plays and getting his playmakers in space. You look at Coach Koldnicki back at Kansas, 10.2 yards per pass attempt at Kansas in 2023. That was number 2 in the country, only behind LSU. You saw that kind of offense for Penn State against West Virginia. And I don't think West Virginia is a cakewalk team in the slightest. And again, we have seen Penn State put up offensive production against these kind of teams. When I went back and watched the football game, it looked different. Like there was a much more of an emphasis on pre-snap motion, getting your playmakers in space with the football in the hands, pushing the ball down the field. We never saw that from Penn State over the last couple of years. I give James Franklin a ton of credit for kind of going what I think is outside his comfort zone on the offensive side of the football to try to get this Penn State team over the top. And I think they certainly have a chance to do so. You look at Michigan, the USC fans, I know y'all are going to feed me in the comment section for having Michigan over USC. And I don't even know how great I feel about it after watching Michigan against Fresno State. Now, where I would argue that I'm comfortable putting Michigan at 4 over USC. And again, it is very close, and we're going to get that answer awfully quick. Michigan never really looks that dynamic on offense, even when they had J.J. McCarthy. It was never pretty on offense. That's just not how Michigan operates as a program. I still think that defense is one of, if not the best defenses in the country. And I think kind of similar to how we talked about Oregon. Michigan only returned one starter on the offensive side of the football, and that was tight end Colson Loveland. A lot of new faces on the offensive line. You could tell they weren't entirely gelled. I think the biggest concern you have is Davis Warren, a quarterback that you can beat teams like USC, Penn State, Oregon, and Ohio State with. That's probably the biggest question that us as Michigan fans have. And we didn't necessarily get the answer against Fresno State, right? Davis Warren only threw the football 10 plus yards down the field 6 times. He only completed one of those passes. As a Michigan fan myself, yeah, that is a little bit concerning. The run game outside of the fourth quarter left a lot to be desired as well. That's probably another one of those things that you're concerned about. But you kind of make no mistake about it. This defense is going to allow Michigan to be very competitive in a lot of football games. And if you can see that Michigan offense continue to kind of find its rhythm with a lot of new faces, I think this Michigan team will be just fine. I think we're going to get a really big answer about this Michigan team week 2 as they host Texas. So we're going to leave Michigan at 4 for right now, subject to change. After that game against Texas, it really either way. You look at USC, legitimate contender. I don't think there's a question mark you can have about that. Where does Miller, I would start on the offensive side of the football here and say, where does Miller Moss rank as a quarterback in the Big Ten? I was extremely impressed with what we saw from Miller Moss against that LSU defense. And granted, the LSU defense was not very good last year, but they made some changes. I think they have talent on the defensive side of the football, but any way you cut it, like Miller Moss, I think is much better than a lot of the national media gave him credit for. He leads the country right now in big time worthy throws. I think that tells you a little bit about the juice that Miller Moss brings. And at the end of the day, you kind of just trust Lincoln Riley to get the best out of his quarterbacks. I think another thing we learned was the USC wide receiver room is significantly better than what a lot of people gave them credit for. You talk about, we all know Zachariah Branch, but Jacoby Lane, Kyron Hudson, Deuce Robinson, difference makers on the outside. That USC offense has the chance to be one of the best offenses that we see in the Big Ten. Now, the big storyline was, and this is kind of why I had USC in the dark horse category as opposed to a contender, is this defense going to take a step? And we were kind of optimistic, right? We saw Coach Dan Lin do the exact same thing 12 months ago with the UCLA defense. I don't know why it was such a massive question where people kind of just assumed he couldn't do it at USC. From what we learned on Sunday night, he's going to be able to do it at USC as well. That defense, and again, LSU, I thought played a very good game on the offensive side of the football. I think Garrett Nussmeier is a dude. I think their offensive line is very good. I think they got a lot of talented wide receivers on the outside. What you learn from USC's defense is they're faster, they're playing more physical, and they're playing much more disciplined. You saw one blown coverage all game against LSU. You saw multiple blown coverages and missed tackles pretty much every single game for USC, regardless of who they were playing last year. I think this USC defense has fundamentally and significantly changed from last year. That was the answer we needed. And we saw it against LSU on Sunday. They are legitimate contender in the Big Ten. Now, excuse me, going to the dark horse category, teams that I think if things pan out, they're playing for a Big Ten championship game in the month of November. Let's start with the Iowa Hawkeyes. We knew that their defense was going to be very good in 2024. We certainly saw that again against an FCS opponent, but I don't think we have any question marks about the defense. Our big question mark was, what is this offense going to look like? Can it not be the worst offense at the Power 5 level? I think you saw that. And again, an FCS opponent, but there were some things that really encouraged you. One, the emphasis on creating more space within the offense and the emphasis of pushing the ball down the field. Iowa does not need to have a top 40 offense in the country to compete in the Big Ten. They just got to be like top 80. You can't compete in the Big Ten having the worst offense really in the Big Ten and in the country and compete in one of the best conferences in the country. I think Iowa showed some flashes of that specifically in the second half. If we get an Iowa offense that is, just somewhat improved with the new offensive coordinator, this team's going to be dangerous. And I had my question marks about Iowa's offense, and I thought it had a lot more to do with just the lack of personnel than the offensive play calling. And I'm not trying to defend Brian Ferentz. Like, it was a disaster in terms of the play calling. That being said, I was more concerned with, all right, you changed the offensive coordinator, but do you have the dudes to really have a good offense? Uh, More optimistic than I was a week ago in terms of what this Iowa offense can be. Very similar story with Nebraska. We're very confident that this Nebraska defense is going to be very good. It was very good last year. What is the quarterback position going to look like with true freshman Dylan Raiola? You can tell it's different. This team is operating in more space. They're pushing the ball down the field a little bit more. Dylan Raiola gets all the media headlines. I think another massive storyline about this Nebraska offense is they got legitimate dudes on the outside. I mean, last year it was true freshmen that clearly were not ready to be contributors in 2023. Now you have guys like Isaiah Neyor and Jamal Banks, who I think will be NFL draft picks in less than 8 months. That matters for Dylan Raiola, and it's only going to help the run game. I mean, you saw this UTEP defense had to respect what Nebraska could do working vertically down the field. That's something we never saw last year. And so just injecting Dylan Raiola, Jamal Banks, and Isaiah Neyor into this Nebraska offense, I think fundamentally changes it. They continue to play good defense, and Dylan Raiola continues to get better as a freshman. This team is going to be dangerous, and we're going to find out a lot about this Nebraska team Saturday night as they take on Colorado. Coming in at number 8, I'm going with the Washington Huskies. This might be a little bit of a, I wouldn't say overreaction, but I might be a little bit higher on Washington than a lot of other national media members. Not that I'm a national media member. Definitely didn't mean that. Why I'm high on Washington? I trust the quarterback, and I think this is a big storyline in the Big Ten where you look at a lot of these quarterbacks in the Big Ten. How many do we really like, especially kind of at the bottom of the Big Ten, right? Max Brosmer at Minnesota, Ethan Garbers at UCLA struggled in a big way. Look, Will Rogers has been a very good quarterback in the SEC for years, and he's playing for a coach in Jed Fish that knows how to dial up an offense and create an explosive offense. It's kind of one of the few offenses that I kind of trust in the Big Ten. Now, do you have question marks along the lines of scrimmage on both sides of the football? Yes, absolutely. But I'm going to lean with a team that I look at and say I trust the quarterback, and that is Will Rogers with Jed Fish, with maybe some underrated weapons on the outside. I thought Giles Jackson looked awesome in terms of how they were using him. A little bit higher on this Washington team coming out of week 1, going to Wisconsin. Look, Tyler Van Dyke is going to be a huge storyline in the Big Ten. Like, can Phil Longo and Tyler Van Dyke get on the same page? Tyler Van Dyke's a guy that, and I've kind of said this plenty of times, he's not a processor. You have to script up the throws for Tyler Van Dyke, but if you do that well, like, Tyler Van Dyke can make the throws. And so can Phil Longo do that for Wisconsin is the biggest question that we have. It wasn't necessarily pretty week 1 for Wisconsin. I don't think a lot of us expected it to be pretty week 1. Can this offense continue to get better over the next couple of weeks? Because I do think they have a quarterback that is extremely talented, although it's kind of a roller coaster. I think they have a very good offensive coordinator in Phil Longo. I'm going to leave Wisconsin in that dark horse category because I think they have the potential to be a dark horse. We didn't necessarily see it, but I'm going to leave them up there. Going to the teams that impressed me, and I wouldn't say even towards the bottom half of the Big Ten, because I look at the Big Ten and say it's a really fun conference. There's some depth here. Look at Rutgers. Rutgers, it ain't ever going to be pretty. And Greg Schiano knows that. He's going to run the football. He's going to play good defense. That's going to be a tough out for a lot of teams in the Big Ten. He's going to kind of drag those games into the mud. He's going to kind of turn that clock over. There's not going to be a lot of possessions. And because of that, Rutgers is going to find themselves in a lot of second half games that are very close. I think the big question mark is, can Nathan Calic-McManus be a guy that can win you some of those football games in the fourth quarter? I don't think we necessarily saw that on Thursday night against Howard. That being said, I think they're going to put themselves in a lot of spots that you're going to be looking up and saying, "Oh, we're playing Rutgers, and it's a 3-point game in the fourth quarter." I think Rutgers is going to put themselves in a lot of those spots. They're going to be a tricky out for a lot of different teams. Going next to Maryland, Billy Edwards is a gamer, man. Like, I look at Billy Edwards and say, yeah, is he not as flashy as Tully in terms of the arm talent? Yeah, absolutely. That being said, Maryland, I think, has been kind of that underrated team in the Big Ten because they've had to play Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State every single year. Now that they don't, I think their record is going to reflect more of how good this program has been under Coach Loxley. I don't think they're going to contend for a Big Ten, but I do think they have a gritty quarterback in Billy Edwards. I think they have some really interesting wide receivers in Ty Felton and Caden Prather. Uh, Again, one of the offenses that I might kind of trust in the Big Ten. Going to Illinois, Luke Altmaier, Pat Bryant. I wouldn't say it was necessarily an extremely impressive performance for Illinois. I think the big question mark, I think the offense will be able to be all right. I think they have a really solid offensive line. Apparently, they hit with a guy in J.C. Davis at left tackle. I think the big question is this defense taking a step? And it took a massive step back in 2023 when you lose Coach Ryan Walters and 3 NFL draft picks that were top 70 dudes. Absolutely. They didn't really hammer the transfer portal on the defensive side of the football, which tells me that they, might kind of like what they have in the back end. They just need to get a little bit more experience. We'll kind of see how it goes year 2 post Ryan Walters on the defensive side of the football. Indiana, really tough team for me to get a read on. It is a brand new roster. I still want to see it kind of come together against some better opponents. You look at Purdue. Hudson Card, 24-25. Again, a quarterback that we've seen play some good football at times. I think the talent level is still not great, but they did impress me week 1. Teams that we need to see more from: Michigan State, a really weird one in terms of, hey, we love the talent of Aiden Childs, but you could tell Aiden Childs is still a young pup at quarterback, and I don't necessarily know if they have the guys around him. I thought Lynch Adams looked awesome at running back. Line of scrimmage play, I would like to see it be a little. That's kind of where my big question mark is on both sides of the football. Now, I thought that Michigan State defense, specifically on the defensive line, actually looked a lot better than I thought they would look. But I do have question marks about the offensive line and what they can do around Aiden Childs. I think Aiden Childs is going to be a really good football player, but you got to put some pieces around him, and I'm just not sure they have those pieces yet on the offensive side of the football. And Aiden Childs was a little loose with the football too. We didn't see him turn the football over during his limited playing time at Oregon State. You saw him put the ball in harm's way a decent amount of the time for Michigan State week 1 against the team in FAU that I think solid but not great. UCLA probably concerned me the most. And this was another one of those teams that was just really hard to get a read on, right? Ethan Garber is a talented kid out of high school, hasn't played a ton. And I think my biggest concern for UCLA, especially with Deshaun Foster taking over, was, all right, we think they're going to try to run the football. They struggled to run the football against Hawaii, which gives me concern. Can they run the football against teams in the Big Ten? And Ethan Garbers didn't really strike me as a quarterback that you can rely on to win you football games. I thought the defense was okay against a Hawaii offense that's going to spread you out and throw the football around, but the defense concerned me. The offense concerned me. I want to see more from them. Northwestern, Minnesota, and Northwestern gritty win against Miami of Ohio, and then Minnesota didn't run the football particularly well against the UNC defense that I kind of expected them to run the football. Max Brosmer certainly didn't impress, and I get the weather wasn't great. You got to see more from PJ Fleck and company. That's how the Big Ten shakes out for me after week 1. Again, next Thursday, we're going to jump on update the Big Ten power rankings. That's how it stands right now. A lot of potential for movement, right? Michigan is playing Texas. You look at Nebraska, they're playing Colorado. Maryland and Michigan State square off. We're going to get some movement post week 2. We'll kind of update you guys on Thursday afternoon. We'll cut it out there. Again, appreciate y'all rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.